Season 3, we think episode 5. This week's discussion is going to be about witchcraft and the subject of death. I am Brian Cain, and this is my co-host, Levi Rowland. We are both high priests of the Alexandrian witchcraft tradition and reside here in New Orleans. So as you can see, we are back at the store. We're back at the shop in the regular studio.
Here in New Orleans.
Where the camera doesn't show our beards growing. And I'm
You're
so
very pleased
happy
about this,
that.
aren't you?
Look, everyone, I've become 20 years younger in a week. Because that camera was good, but it was not
There's such
nice.
a thing as too good.
It was not nice.
You know what I mean?
It was like it showed more flaws than the human eye, you know? So it's definitely challenging, but I recognize it was high quality. If it was set up better, you know, not right up in our faces.
This is how we're beginning this intense discussion of witchcraft and death. It's like, the angle on my pores. I'm like, Brian, death.
So anyway, let's say, okay, so tonight's subject, people are really, really excited about it. And it doesn't surprise me because death is a trendy subject these days. You've
forever.
Got a lot of, it does tend to be a consistent part of the human experience.
I think a big one.
But it is a trend in, it's been a growing trend in the witchcraft world, which is actually quite interesting because when I first came to the craft, death obviously was a part of it because as a nature religion, being a fertility cult, it's the natural cycles of life. Whether you're concentrating on a wheat field or a garden or hunting, death's there, death is there. And I've always sort of seen that the archetype of the god and the goddess as, if you were going to cut it down to polar opposites, that she represents life and he represents death. We get that very early on in the witchcraft mythology, that the very earliest goddess was the source of life. She was fertility. She was linked to the moon, et cetera, et cetera. We've all heard these stories. And he was a hunting god, which intimately connects you to death. Killing something is connecting you to death. And that survival process, eventually he became more agricultural and was associated with the harvest, another symbol of death. Go on to become a war god. And
death.
Eventually we would get death gods.
There's a theme in human history.
So
really.
Obviously they both have, there are plenty of goddesses associated with death. And in witchcraft, he is the god of death and resurrection. So, we don't actually just see him as death. But in that nature sense, it's always been there. But outside of, maybe Halloween, we didn't really focus too much on the dead in our work. We would focus on it, to honor past initiates or ancestral spirits of the craft. And it was a time to, invite them in the merriment. And it was the time to acknowledge that. But it wasn't really a part of like the workings, It was a religion of life. And if you think about it, and I have, we are surrounded with a lot of death in this world. In some ways, Christianity is a cult of death, especially Catholicism.
Can be.
It's all associated with, dead saints and,
reliquaries.
If you go over to the churches in Europe, they're very, I remember me and Levi going into some beautiful cathedral in Bath, England, and it smelled like death. And there were literally like coffins under the floor, and Levi was throwing holy water on me, which
it happened once.
But it felt like death. It did. So witchcraft is a religion of life, and that's what we primarily focus on. But when I actually came to New Orleans is when I first met my future husband, Christian Day, and he had written a book called The Witch's Book of the Dead, which of course I read. I was dating the guy, right? It's very good. And what I really appreciated about it is that there had not been any other book written like that. Like nobody was talking about that in witchcraft. And he really draws upon history and folklore and tradition and really approaches that subject and gives you a way to sort of like, contemplate that idea in your personal magics, and I think, for me personally, the part of it that resonates with me the most is, I'm not particularly interested in dead people any more than I am in living people. Like they're kind of the same to me.
Brian hates everyone.
Yeah,
the
dying does not necessarily make someone more interesting or more powerful. Maybe when we all die, we get these superpowers bestowed upon us, but I don't think so. However, the people that I do like, the people who actually knew me, I've always kind of said, I don't really think death has a time frame. So when it comes to spirits and reincarnation and all that sort of thing, and we'll get to some of that, I sort of really feel like that the people that knew you actually knew, like your grandmother or your parents or people who actually knew you while they were alive who passed on. I do think that they keep an eye on you in some way. I think that there's sort of a, and you know, like if I were to die and somebody said, well, you can go on in now, or you can wait the eternal 30 minutes for the rest of your party. You know, because I don't think time really consists that way. Yeah. I think those are the ones who often really do wait around unless there's some deeper meaning or something wrong with them. But, you know.
Like if your aunt's a psychopath, you know, you might not get to meet her.
So I don't really work with the dead. Possibly. I do honor them. But I did have an incident once happen in my family where there were some problems going on with some of the grandchildren, and I had a conversation with my grandmother about it. The situation was resolved. I don't know if it was my grandmother or not. I've got no idea. I do think she's around. The last words my father spoke before he died was "mama," which was his mother, was my grandmother. So was she really there in the room? I don't know, you know, but it wouldn't surprise me. So does that have anything to do with witchcraft? No, it doesn't. It's a human experience. But, you know, what Christian did with that work was unprecedented. It had never been done. It was an original piece of work. And since then, many people have copied it, quite frankly, and have been inspired by it. So copying isn't always cheap. Sometimes it's just inspiration.
Imitation, flattery,
yeah,
etc.
Depends on whether it was well done or not. So, you know, I think that that's a really good book to read if you're interested in the subject. But today we're also going to be focusing on what death means to the initiates of the craft and what we were taught about it and what the core egregore is. You know, obviously we're not focused on it. We're not a religion of death. We don't pray to death. We're not praying to the dead. That's not the things that we're doing. You know, we work with a goddess and a god, and we work with hosts of other entities that support our work, generally associated with the elements. So nature spirits, I guess you could say. But, you know, doesn't mean we don't believe in the dead. It doesn't mean we don't have personal works. It doesn't mean we're not psychic. You know, all those things sort of come together. So I don't know any witches who don't believe in something going bump in the night. However, it's just not what the religion is focused on primarily. You know, we're focused on the life force, fertility. So we were primarily taught early on that reincarnation, and, you know, I've got to sort of apologize for using these time-old terminologies, because witches don't believe in reincarnation the way that like a strict Buddhist does, or in the way that like maybe some other more structured faiths do. Nor do we believe in the afterlife in some sort of structured way. And personally, looking through the lens of being a witchcraft priest, I sort of believe in it all. So I believe that there is another world, another side. You know, some people might call it heaven, some people might call it hell, some people might, you know, use it to describe spirits, but I believe in another side, and I believe that sometimes we come back into the flesh. I do believe those things and have had some experiences within my life that sort of validate that for me. And that fits in with the witchcraft. So we don't have like this strict, like, you know, well, if you're bad, you're going to come back as a grasshopper or this or that. There are some mythologies that have grown up around it. You know, there's an idea that if you take your path of initiation to a certain extent, to a certain place, that you will come back as an initiate again. That is a belief held within witchcraft, and even may gravitate to your fellow initiates from a past life, that you'd be drawn back together. A good coven, for instance, will be drawn back together. This is a part of the belief system. So I don't think a lot of people know that. I think a lot of people think, oh, reincarnation, that's an Eastern concept. You know, it's not really.
No, it's been in the West for a long time.
Yeah, it's been in the West for a long time, and
transmigration.
You know,
the Pythagoreans.
It's believed that the Celts believed in it. In a sense, you can find things that the Egyptians did. You know?
It's in esoteric Judaism too. Yeah. The concept of Gilgal.
I actually heard once that reincarnation was an extremely popular belief over in Israel.
Oh, I'm sure it is.
Yeah.
Modern Israeli Jews are mostly secular, and there's a large New Age movement there, and lots of new religions. I mean, the Baha'i house of worship, not that they believe in it, but it's there too. It's a very religiously diverse place. There a lot of them are ethnically Jewish, but they're not tied to it.
In a lot of ways, I think that my my personal belief system, which to me goes along with the craft, is very similar to, what Levi can speak on as far as like the, what we might say the Druids believed in, which was that was the idea that you died and you were born on the other side and you could die again.
You could die there,
yeah. Born again here.
And it was non-linear.
Yes.
It wasn't linear. So
kind of how I believe in a way.
One of the things, I actually think if there's any world mythology that we could go to the most for sort of what I think has the closest, not that's what's strictly taught in witchcraft, because like Brian says, although there are some dogmas such as reincarnation, it's mostly left open, right? But if there's something I think that could get the spirit or the feel of it, it's much more Celtic than other mythologies, because in a lot of Celtic mythologies, what's jarring to the reader is that it is non-linear. Mm-hmm. So because they were originally meant to be sung by bards, they were not meant to be written down. And so a lot of the legends will come off as circular and bizarre, because somebody will be alive in this one time period and then they're dead and they're in the fairyland and then they're back again, but it's the wrong time frame. And if you're reading it in this, with this expectation of a linear story, it doesn't make any sense. But if you look at it as lives lived across many lifetimes, across many epochs and many places, but with no concept of linear time because it's beyond that, I think it gets close to the feel of what you'll find a lot of, initiates talking about.
Yes, yeah. I was having a conversation with an elder I'm not going to name drop or anything like that. And the subject came up, and I was asked if I'd ever done, regression work.
Yeah,
I would certainly welcome it. We have not done regression work in our group. Surprisingly, I mean, we do all have a healthy bit of skepticism. We're real occultists, and we really believe in what we believe in. But we don't want to parade a fantasy for anyone either. So, if I got with someone who was really well trained, and I certainly would, hypnosis or whatever,
I've done it.
Try something out?
I've done it.
Did you get anything?
I'm not a huge fan. I don't want to say anything negative, because I know for a lot of people, regression therapy
it didn't work for you.
It did work. I mean, images come through. I just don't really honestly see the point in it. I just don't think it's a very.
But did you have an experience?
Yeah, I had a spiritual experience. It was very vivid.
Did you feel like it was real?
In the moment, yeah.
So later you questioned it.
I wouldn't even say that I questioned it necessarily. It was just, okay, it was like, it's not information that I could use in my spiritual path. Mm. And I feel like that's true for a lot of people who go through this.
There's a reason why we
see them sort of doing it. Yeah. You know what I mean? And this is actually true in other religions that do believe in rebirth or reincarnation, depending on Buddhist, Hindu, whatever. I mean, there are Buddhist parables that say that, the Buddha learned all of his past lives underneath the tree, in Bodh But he specifically sort of says in multiple places in the Pali Canon that it's kind of irrelevant to know your past lives. And he tells a whole group of bhikkhus, which are monks, that all you need to know is that you've cried enough tears to fill every ocean and lost enough blood to fill every river, and let's get to the work of being better, And I sometimes feel that way about regression. I mean, the word itself is kind of problematic, because I don't think death is linear anyway. So maybe you're seeing future lives. I think it's just as likely that if we could see other lives, I think it would be just as likely to see one deep in the future, but nobody ever does, and I think that's kind of a red flag.
Yeah, I believe in it because I've had some experiences that I couldn't explain intellectually, but it had nothing to do with witchcraft. So actually in my childhood, I used to have this reoccurring dream that I was living in somewhere around the 50s. I'm not a really great historian as far as that time period, but I do know I was in a war, so it was either World War I or World War II. I suspect World War II based on what I saw in images, because I saw a car, and I don't know cars really well, but I was married and I was living with his parents. I never saw myself, so I didn't know if I was male or female, but I felt like I was female. So I never saw myself. The parents were horrible people that didn't really want me in their house. I was there because... And
dark.
Didn't come back. He didn't come back. I know that. So I always woke up from that dream either feeling very happy because I was so in love, or very sad because I knew he wasn't coming back. And this was very young that I started having these dreams. They just eventually went away, But I was like, there was no movie, there was no concept. I wasn't even practicing the occult at the time. There was no reason for this, that was logical. And I suppose you could dig one up, but it really was just very strange. I've had other ones, like I had a repeated one that I used to, a man would come in the front door and shoot me, and I fell downstairs. I had that over and over and again. Once again, not anything to do with witchcraft, not, sorry, no fabulous things,
I know. I love it when everybody does past life regression and everybody's Mary Queen of Scots.
I mean,
everyone is a druid.
First of all, wouldn't it be depressing to find out you were Cleopatra and you'd be like...
And then I'm this now?
And now I'm this.
Oh my God.
And I've done nothing, So
and it's
hundreds
Wednesday,
of years later, and
not
I'm
even wearing
not
pants.
progressing.
I used to be the richest woman on earth and own Egypt. I'll say this. I will say one of the things that's popping up in occult circles that I travel in and people I read for sometimes is this bizarre use of it's a past life issue, or I'm dealing with some shadow work from my past lives. Okay, maybe you're just a bad person. It's a theology of the excuse, right? It's like, why can't I hold down a job? It's just because in my past life I feel like I'm not. No. You can't hold a job because you smoke a lot of weed and you don't show up on time. Period. End of story. It's like, my relationship's just on the rocks. I think in a past life maybe. No. It's because you spend too much time watching porn and you're a bad lover. Like, we're done here. Like, I feel like it is a much more spiritual thing to focus on your life right now and try to better it with the tools that you have than to blame it on something else. If I hear one more person with not to be rude here, but with a shitty life tell me that they're ancestrally cursed, I'm going to be like, you're not though. Yeah. Like, you're not though.
My family's cursed. Okay. So I did want to say, if you would like to call in with questions about tonight's topic or any question about Alexandrian witchcraft or witchcraft in general, please call in the number on your screen, 504-321-3472. Levi doesn't think I should have to say.
No, it's fine. I'll tell you this. Blame, like Eddie says something like, blaming it on ancestors. People do that. And I mean, I will say this. I respect people who have ancestral worship traditions. I think it is a valid form of religious experience for multiple people across the world. It's a massive part of East Asian religion. It's a massive part of African traditional religions and their American and Caribbean counterparts. It's a huge part of Catholicism. I'm not going to knock it.
Yeah,
I will say that I don't do it. I don't
engage
engage with it. As I have said before, the Calvinist ghosts of Appalachia do not get to talk to me anymore. Right? I have no desire to speak to them. Right? And I don't think that makes me less of a spiritual person or anybody who's not as enlightened, as it were.
I believe in spirits. I've had lots of interactions with spirits. When I make the comment I don't find the dead very interesting, it's because I don't. Because meeting the dead is a lot like meeting the general public. If you open yourself up to it, I believe in mediumship. I believe you can talk to the dead. I could talk to the dead. I could turn it on, talk to them all day long if I wanted to. I don't want to. Nor would I want to send out that beacon, because then they will come. And I don't want to deal with it, but, just like I could go down and be on Bourbon Street and talk to people all day long.
Christian has a very good point in the comments. He said, Brian, you barely find anyone interesting.
Sure.
So maybe that's why he's not into necromancy, is because he's like, I don't even like the living. Like,
if Aleister Crowley wants to show up, or Alex Sanders, or Gerald Gardner, or somebody like that, sure. Doreen, you want to talk? I'm down
right
for
here.
Tea. But that's not whoever comes. You want to know why? Because they found better things to do.
But there's two different kinds of working with the dead. Well, there's multiple kinds of working with the dead, if we're going to talk about the death and magic. In Christian's book, and it's something he says earlier in here, it's like it was used because there was a large belief that the God that made the universe, or Isis or whatever, is a little too busy for your petty problems, and so you went to the spirits of your ancestors or spirits that were local or whatever to help you with things magically. There's a long tradition of that, but I think it's impossible to talk about working with the dead without addressing this huge pink elephant in the room, which is the spiritualist movement. The fact is that the entire Western world's concept of what happens after we die, how you work with the dead, what the word necromancy is or whatever, you cannot get away from the fact that the spiritualist movement was huge. It's bigger than any New Age movement in history. You could add up every witchcraft initiate since Gerald Gardner. It would be 1/1,000,000th of the amount of people who have been in the United States Spiritualist Association. It was the largest alternative religious movement in Western history. They used to be able to pack Madison Square Gardens. They had famous people in their circles like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. This was the alternative spiritualist revival of the modern world. The occult cannot hold it a candle in terms of numbers. And so it's very important to realize that when we're talking about working with the dead in modern, non-traditional religion, 9 times out of 10, you are talking about mediums who came from the spiritualist churches. People who were informed by the Fox sisters, people who were informed by a lot of suffragettes actually historically were big spiritualists. That's really where it comes from. So it is important. When we talk about necromancy, I love how we all secretly think we're talking about people in the graveyard with John Dee's mystical circles. And I'm like, no, you're talking about a sweet Christian lady at a table who's broken away from her local Methodist church because she is absolutely sure that a dead Native American is talking to her. Like, that is where it is, guys.
Well, religion traditionally, if we want to look at the history of religion, pre-Christian religion as well as Christianity, a lot of people get involved in religion because they want answers to what's going to happen to them when they die. You know,
absolutely.
We have a programmed thing in our, you know, we are programmed to want to survive. We are programmed to want to survive. We have a strong instinct to want to survive. So the idea that we won't survive someday is naturally hard for us, for our instincts. There's a fear that kicks in, and it's biologically put into our bodies. So it's natural for human beings to want to have answers. Obviously, you know, we weren't meant to have the full answer because no one has it. But I do believe we were given clues. I think we were given a little bit of reassurance, you know, and I think that's for two reasons. If we knew 100% what was going to happen, you know, people might be dropping off the program just to get out of Dodge and go there. And if we absolutely didn't believe anything was possible, a lot of people would be dropping off the program to cease to exist with no consequences. So I think we were left in this sort of limbo thing on purpose. I think it's in our best interest to not completely know, but I think it's in our best interest to have core things. You know, what we can say is throughout humanity, you can go on any place in the globe at any time period, in any culture of people who are often isolated from all other human beings, and they had the similar beliefs. You know, the idea of another world, the idea of ghosts, the idea of reincarnation, it's multicultural. It's everywhere. It pops up in every field of humanity and every experience. But a lot of religions were designed around that for the common people, you know, and it doesn't surprise me that, you know, a lot of the ancestral worship that we find outside of venerating one's own family is done by people who wouldn't have had access to the greatest temples or high education at some time periods. You know, I don't think that's the way that intellectuals were necessarily always thinking. But then there was also custom and tradition as well, you know, and Levi's right, and so is Christian by virtue of his book, that this is a long living tradition to respect your ancestors, to respect the dead. And we do it in witchcraft, but we tend to focus on our initiatory ancestors, you know, and that's one of the things that I highlight a lot about witchcraft is the fact that it is not a cultural religion. So we might have things in common with the Egyptians or the Celts, and we might come from Britain, but our movement is really, you know, multicultural, and reincarnation is part of the reason why.
Yes.
And one of the reasons why, you know, I'll be honest, it makes the most sense to me in a fair way. You know, like we all have to go through the same experiences here or somewhere else, you know, because I believe that there's other worlds. I believe there's other planets with life. I don't think you're necessarily reincarnated on Earth all the time.
No.
We have a Covendom member. I'm pretty sure she's been on other planets.
She might be there right now.
She might be there right now.
She might be.
Won't name names. But so anyway, so if you have any questions, please call in. We love that.
Also, thank you for all the wonderful comments. Blessed be to the initiates that are watching, Carrie, Christian, everybody else. I saw your comments. So happy you're here.
I don't always get to see the comments because he's managing them. Sometimes he hides questions.
I do hide certain comments that I don't want Brian to answer because I'm afraid of what he'll say. And I'm like, I don't want to do this right now. I'll just see a comment. I'm like, we're not doing that. We are not.
So if I don't answer your questions, it's because Levi's concealed them
yes,
from me.
If you ask controversial...
Which you can't do if you call in. 504-321-3472.
I will cut you off, though. So I wanted to say... So what I wanted to say is that the reincarnation thing, I think, is very important to realize one thing, which is initiatory craft does not make it a dogmatic teaching about how that looks. And we've said this before, but I really want to reiterate it, how it operates, what the system or functionality behind it is. I would say, and I think Brian has said this as well, reincarnation is a belief of initiatory witchcraft period en point c'est tout.
In a vague sense.
Yes, but there's no.
And the only reason we use that word is because it's the
right?
only word. Witchcraft doesn't really have a word for it. Like if you actually were to study our liturgy or the Book of Shadows, it never says the word reincarnation. That is not in our liturgy, the word reincarnation. It just says we will come back.
Yeah, or rebirth, I think. Maybe.
Yes, rebirth. We will come back. You can. It actually says you can. It doesn't say you will. It says you can.
Yeah, maybe you're terrible and you don't get to come back.
And it actually does emphasize sometimes that some people may not be able to come back. So, it exists, but yes, Levi's right. It's not in any strict, it's a dogma in the loosest sense.
Exactly. But we're not saying, there are things I think that if somebody believed really strongly, I think would be difficult to maintain in the philosophy of craft.
Well, that's the other big thing that I wanted to point out. So when I say witchcraft isn't a religion of death, it's because we aren't. We're not focused on the afterlife. Our workings and what we're doing with our goals and what we're doing as initiates, none of our work is focused on how we're going to get into heaven. Like it's not. Our work is focused on how we evolve ourselves and our souls and how we can be better individuals here and now. And our focus is always on the here and now. It's just simply we're not focusing on how am I going to be in a better life next time?
Yeah.
Or, how can I get a high seat in Summerland or whatever it's going to be? How can I sit on the right hand of Satan? None of these things are...
I've already, first of all...
maybe that one.
I've already made some deals.
So...
Elohim has a really good question that ties into this. So, certain religions, he mentions the Kumi and whatnot, have specific funerary rituals. Do we have that in Alexandrian craft?
Well, okay. So things have evolved. Things have popped up. So in our lineage, we do have a particular a ritual that can be used for someone who's passed on. And it's sort of used, it can be used in multiple ways. It can be used to honor their... It's used to honor their wishes, really, honestly. So yes, we do have funerary rites. They're, sort of developed between different lineages. And then some things are sort of organic and have evolved. For instance, I know, Alex had a particular, ritual, and I know other initiates and what have you who've sort of had ones that are similar.
Yeah.
But, generally speaking, like I didn't know him, but I know of a ritual that I've been, given privy to by Sandra Wright, because she was there, and his name was Richard Ravish, and he passed away. And the Alexandrians in his local area, I think he was put in like an oak box, and he had an acorn put in his mouth, and they braided things into his beard, talismans and everything. His body was treated very well. I'm under the impression that something very similar, has happened with a lot of people, but it's organic, it's magical. The body's just prepared. When it has happened, sometimes it's done in sort of a wake style. So I know, for instance, there's photos of when Stuart died, his coffin was held in the house and it was in the center of a circle. That was what was happening. So yes and no. From myself personally, I used to say I always want to get cremated. Now I want to be mummified, and I want my own pyramid, but Christian's fighting me on this. So yeah, I know what I'll do. I'll put it in some will. You've got to do this. Well, the problem is having a thing here in New Orleans would be very difficult, because unless you have family that's already in one of the upper things, it's really hard to get that nowadays. I don't quite know how it works for the average Joe, but a lot of that stuff, if you're not Catholic or if you're not a Mason or whatever place it is that's doing that, it's hard to get one of the spots. And essentially they're cremated anyway because it's
an ossuary. Eventually they're pushed back with the bones. Logan asked a question about souls, which I think, I honestly, Logan, the question of whether or not the soul can deteriorate within the body or whatever, I don't really know about that. I think souls are sort of indestructible, but I will say this. I wanted to hit on one thing that I am glad that your question brought up, which is in a lot of occult teachings and esoteric concepts throughout history, whether it's Egyptian religion, Hermetic Kabbalah, Neoplatonism,
Logan, I'm not
Pythagoreanism, poor. A lot of traditional beliefs believe that there were multiple souls, and I'm a huge believer in this personally. So I think it's very important to realize that when we talk about death and ghosts, we're not always talking about the same thing. It was perfectly reasonable in some traditional occult circles and in Neoplatonist circles to believe that you could have a part of you left behind that could still have some form of consciousness and talk to people, et cetera, but then the true part of yourself could go back to the Godhead, and then one part could die with the earth, be biological. This is all part of, the story. So it's important to realize that there's a lot of narratives historically in the West when it comes to these kind of teachings. You're not stuck with any sort of dogmatic, this is how it works, this is the exact mechanics of what happens. And I personally, I'm not saying this is Alexandrian teaching at all, but I'm a big believer in the whole multiple soul concept.
When I, sort of started studying the work of the Egyptians, and, this is one of the ideas that there's a multiple soul that Levi's sort of talking about. Some of it resonated with me, and I will say, okay, so let's look at the Egyptians, for instance, a very unique, interesting, pre-Christian peoples. I mean, you can't really people make the mistake of trying to sum up Egyptian religion like this was Egyptian religion.
There was no unified Egyptian religion.
No, it was like 4,000 or 5,000 years.
Depending on the city.
Now they're thinking it's even older. They found some stuff recently.
Yeah, exactly. The Ba and the Ka, exactly.
So they're finding new stuff all the time still. So it's very old, and it's gone on and on and on and on. So it's had many religious cults, which is what witchcraft is. It's a religious cult, and I know nowadays we don't like that because we associate it with David Koresh or, whoever those people are. But that has nothing to do with what we're talking about. We're talking about the fact that you had what we would now call religions or dominations or traditions, right? They were called religious cults or mystery cults at one point in time. So you had many of those, and they did not all share the same belief, but they did share the same culture. So some things were just like modern occultism today. There was a lot of interbreeding between those things, and you can trace that in my book, Initiation to Witchcraft. I barely graze that.
Yeah.
But it is the idea that you have these different mystery cults that were connected. The cult of Dionysus eventually connected with Eleusis. The cult of Isis eventually connected with Eleusis. Eleusis wanted it all, and so it was like that with a lot of things. And I suspect more so than we know, which is very similar to what you have to modern occultism. You can find a connection between the Masons and the Golden Dawn and the OTO and witchcraft. Like there's an interbreeding of ideas. So some of those things culturally stay consistent, right? So you had that in Egypt. But it evolved. Originally speaking in Egypt, it was like you died and you were believed to go to the other side. And on the other side, your life was going to mirror this. As time went on, it became way more complex, and there were a lot more rules. But I also think that it's a little bit about education. So, like when you take a mythological concept like multiple souls, it's a great way to explain a truth that you don't understand. And I got that in Egypt because when I walked into the room with the mummies of the kings, I felt a tremendous amount of power in that room. Tremendous amount of power. And I had to contemplate that. I'm an occultist, so I recognize power when I see power. And I'm like, surely their souls aren't just governing these bodies. Maybe it's the belief people had in them. I'm coming up with these things, but I'm recognizing the very fact that there's true power in them, especially over a Seti's body. And I thought later on, I realized that was one of the beliefs in them with their souls, is that one soul would stay connected to the body and another soul went to the other world. It was a way of explaining this energy and probably the belief system in it, but maybe that's also a way of explaining heaven, ghosts. We do that now. Is Mama a ghost or is Mama in heaven? Maybe Mama's both.
Maybe she's both. I mean, that's a huge part of any sort of tradition that has a belief in multiple souls. I also believe that a lot of beliefs about the dead were about social control.
It became all religion.
I think if you look at the Confucian concept of ancestral worship, it was used to keep rigidly controlled lines of power in place in China, I think, and the other nations that were inspired by Confucianism, Korea, Japan. I think that if you look at beliefs in Christianity, particularly pre-Protestant Reformation, when it was just the Catholic Church in Western Europe, and you have this concept of redemptive suffering will be rewarded after death, but you can't attempt to fix it on earth, is a really good way to quell a rebellion. It's a very good way to keep poor people poor. I think this is one of the reasons I love that witchcraft does not have dogmatic beliefs about death, because if there's one thing that religion pre-scientific revolution was very guilty of doing, it was in all places and in almost all times using it as a stick and carrot situation for control. And as Alexandrians, we value freedom. And I think that giving people the freedom of belief when it comes to death is important, because if you hang something over them, it will be used as a tool of control. And we don't do that.
And whenever you get into the reward punishment system, you have that.
Yep.
You know, and I don't think that's any secret to any of you all, obviously. You know, the church, most of us are exposed to versions of the Christian church doing that.
Yeah.
But it's not just the Christian church. You know, it's been done, and we can even look at Egypt. You know, originally speaking, it was considered a very natural process. There were no rules involved. And I learned this in Egypt we had a really great tour guide who was an Egyptologist, highly educated. And if everything's working, we'll be here in New Orleans.
Yeah.
You'll love her. But she said very early on, if you studied it very early on, it was just natural. It was considered just like you were going to die and you were going to go to heaven, and heaven was like a mirror of this world, but better.
And all that.
And that was just the way it was going to be. And as time went on, there were more and more rules, and then control.
It's all about control.
And then you had to do all these things, and you had to pay the priests for certain spells, and you had to pay for your Book of the Dead to do these spells. So you could, it
creates an industry
the
too.
The richer you were, the more rules there were.
It's very similar to in Catholic Europe. Have any of you ever heard of chantries? You know, which were special monasteries where they sang masses for the dead, and wealthy people donated immense amounts of money so that there would be masses sang for them after they died, or offered up for them.
Because they believed they could be prayed out of hell.
So they could be prayed out, not out of hell. You can never leave hell, but you could be prayed out of purgatory. Right? You know, you never.
Which is probably the only real thing, right?
You know, but so I think that's fascinating. It does create industry. Same in Egypt. It created a massive industry for the scribes and for the mummifiers, right? Which were, it's funny, we like to look back, and Brian and I both have a very deep appreciation for Egypt. But one of the things...
Doesn't mean it wasn't corrupt at all.
Exactly. And one of the things one of my tour guides said is that near the end, especially in the Ptolemaic era, the mummifiers were charlatans. I mean, they were like door-to-door Bible salesmen. They spread bizarre religious cults about having mummified birds in the house. They ended up causing almost near extinction of certain animals or whatever, and it became a fetish. I mean, it became an absolute obsession, and it was about control and money, right?
And wanting to live forever.
Yeah. That's another thing, is I think one of the biggest things that I always see as a mark of spiritual weakness, and I hate to say it that bluntly, is somebody who's absolutely so desperate to control the exact specifications of their ego that it clouds their vision as to any other form of magic or spirituality. Like, if you cannot give up any concept whatsoever that your isolate intelligence will be preserved in no other way besides exactly how it is preserved right now, I think that's problematic. Like, evolution is necessary
so
change.
Levi's saying if you don't believe the way he's believing, then you're a jerk.
That's not what he's saying. He's saying that if the only thing you think in the universe that you want to continue is exactly how you think about your favorite Wednesday night television program, it's problematic.
I believe personally, let's talk a little bit about what we believe personally, and then also let's talk about a little bit about how our relationship with the dead is, like our personal.
Love that.
Which would be a little bit separate, obviously. As normal egregore, in our coven work, we generally speaking, have very few times we work with dead. We do acknowledge our ancestral ancestors on Halloween. We occasionally might acknowledge certain people's birthdays or whatever, but that's about it. So not really a big thing. So personally, I don't have a concrete belief. That's one of my favorite things. Like, I do believe in reincarnation. I do believe in an afterlife, and I do believe that there are spirits. I believe in all these things. I don't obsess on any of them. Like, I don't walk around pretending I see ghosts all the time, because I don't, and I don't want to. I have seen things, I have had experiences. Probably one of the most crazy occult experiences I had was nothing to do with witchcraft or the occult. It was me being 13 years old and seeing a doorknob turn on its own while a door was open. So I got to see both sides, so I had no doubt that it was turning. And it was turning. It wasn't vibrating, it was actually turning. Does that mean I have a full-on explanation as to why it was? No, I do not. But I do think it was a spirit. And my entire family had the experience. I was just the only one that saw it with an open door. Everyone else saw it with closed doors. So there was a skeptical was somebody on the other side, in which I was one of the accused.
Is Brian going around freaking
Brian,
people out?
Yes, is it you? You know,
is it you?
But no, do I know for sure what it was or have an explanation? No, it happened for about a month or so, and then it stopped completely. And I had a couple other experiences that were not as profound, but I do believe it was spiritual activity, poltergeist activity. You know, and it was all pretty much in the same house. I've had other spirits. I've seen animal spirits. I've never seen a human spirit that was a human being. I've felt them. I've gotten messages from them. I've astrally seen them, but I have seen animal spirits. Strangely enough, I've seen animals. We used to
again. It's because you don't actually like people, but you're okay with the dog coming back. Oh, thank God!
It wasn't any of mine. And funny enough, I saw. You know, my mother was an assistant veterinarian, and she worked at a clinic that was like historical. Like it was like really. It was an animal clinic like way back in the 1900s.
Okay.
And the last vet that was in the original building died. He lived and died in there. And I used to see animals in there. One of them was a red Irish setter, and it was only later I found out that other people had seen the red Irish setter. But yeah, we all saw animals down there. It was a vet clinic. They died sometimes, and I don't know what that means. You know, is the poor dog living in the vet clinic now? That's a horrible thought. I don't think so, though. I think you're seeing something, you know, out of time and space. You know, I'm not saying it's not a real spirit. I just don't think it's really with you necessarily. However, he was there, and I never had an experience with him, but a lot of women that worked there would hear their names called. And my mother was one of those women, and it was like a story that went on for generations. She'd worked there for quite some time, and then one day she was alone, and she heard someone say her name. Like, she was alone. She heard a male voice say her name. Startled her. You know, she got up to look and she saw him. And my mother was not a superstitious person. My mother was not that person. She wasn't even really a religious person, really. And she left the building without locking the door and went home. And I remember she was white as a ghost.
Yeah.
She ended up going back and working there, but it was a real experience. This doesn't prove to me I know anything other than something's true about it. You know, I've already told my reincarnation stories. I have no afterlife experiences. You know, I've got no near-death experiences. I've got nothing about
NDEs.
that. No, nothing like that.
I've come very close to death more than once.
So I'd have to say experientially, ghosts and reincarnation, I have more of a personal thing about that. I also believe the reason this is my own thing, the reason we sleep at night, we wake up is to teach us how death works. You know, once in a while you remember your dreams, but usually you don't. Very much like once in a while people have experiences, but usually they don't. So I don't think you know, it's not that nothing's going on while you're asleep. It's just that you don't recollect most of it. You know, there's tons going on. We know that from what we can remember. You know, so, you know, and how often do you have crazy dreams and you can't really remember them later? You know they were vast, but you just can't remember them. You can barely recollect that little moment. Why is that part of the design? I think it's to teach us something. I think that everything we need to know is right here with us and given to us in nature. It's not something that needs to be written in a book. It's already for you.
Yeah.
The sun rises, the sun sets. You fall asleep, you wake up. Plants die in the fall, they're reborn in the spring. You know, it's all in the cycles of life on this planet. Life, death, and rebirth is already happening before our eyes in a myriad of different ways. Doesn't mean it's the same plant, but it is connected to the plant that was there before. You know, so sometimes it's the same plant. Perennials.
Yeah, or annuals.
Not a gardener. I pay people for that.
I can't remember which one is. Yeah.
So my beliefs personally are all of those things, and I don't think that conflicts with craft, because craft doesn't talk about ghosts really, but I don't know any witches who don't believe in them. What you do get organically with the craft is that we believe in, you know, other entities. We believe in nature spirits. We believe in gods. And we do have a phrase in the craft that describes spirits of human beings, and even enlightened, what some people would be called enlightened masters, people who have gone on to be profound enough that they won't reincarnate. I'm not going to say what they are, but you know, that is a thing. So Yeah, hey, so there we go. That's what I believe. I believe in it all, but I don't believe it with any structure. And there's nothing in the craft that, Levi was one of my students. I'd never taught him what was going to happen in the afterlife. That was
He told me that I had to pay him $2,000 a month to get rid of my engrams before Xenu came.
We discussed what was craft belief, and, we're both on the same page. I think, Levi always amuses me greatly because he's a product of his own intelligence. Extremely intelligent. But the thing with extremely intelligent people is they're all crazy, and I'm extremely intelligent, in a different way. And I'm crazy in a different way. But
in a different way, he says.
He's got to bounce a lot of ideas around, and then have some sort of rationale, I do the same thing, I just bounce them around less, I think, probably.
Maybe.
I don't think about it because I'm not afraid of it. I mean, inherently on some level, I'm afraid of it.
Elohim wants to exorcise me.
So it's too late. It's
too late. I've already signed the book, Elohim.
You don't have the powers.
That's not a thing.
Yeah. By the time you've learned how to exercise Levi,
just be dead already. We have a phone call.
We've got to stick.
Hi, welcome to Covendom.
Oh, hi, how's it going? It's Stephen from Sydney, Australia.
It's Stephen from Australia.
Oh, Stephen.
Hey, how's it going?
Good.
It's going well. How are you?
Not bad. Really interesting discussion today. I've got two questions.
Okay.
One of them, just regarding, I guess from your perspective in the Alexandrian craft, working with the dead as teachers. So I know there are some procedures in the grimoires that I've worked with where you conjure pretty much, I guess, the shades of people who have gone before, who may have been magicians or things like that, and to gain instruction from them. So what's your view of that? And is there something similar, perhaps, in the Alexandrian craft?
The question for him.
So the question for anyone who didn't hear is there, in the grimoire tradition, for example, there's a history of summoning the dead as teachers. Right, the people who are great and wonderful or whatever, who are very enlightened, and sort of having them as teachers. I will say it goes beyond the grimoire tradition. Actually, the rabbinical tradition in Kabbalah did this in the Safed school, where they would lay on the tombs of Kabbalists who had died and try to conjure their spirits to speak to them. So it's very popular to do that. And there's also the concept of the enlightened masters and the Akashic records that you find in Theosophy. Would I say that we do that from a witchcraft perspective? I would say, and I'll let Brian answer more deeply, but I would say we do not. Okay. I do not believe that we conjure the dead in a witchcraft circle to be taught by them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Have you ever heard the story of Darth Plagueis the Wise?
Do not make a Star Wars reference here, Brian. Not every
Lord of the Sith.
Yeah.
It was so powerful.
Is it possible to know?
He could even influence the Metachlorians to create life.
Is it possible to learn this?
So, not in any formal way. Not in any formal way. I'm sure. Well, I know that there are witches who have reached out to their initiatory ancestors for guidance. I can't say whether it was effective or not for them because I wasn't a part of the experience. But it's not anything that is taught in any formal way. However, we sort of believe in a sense that our initiatory ancestors are already flowing through us. So as Levi was talking about, the different versions of the soul, perhaps some portion of their soul is with us in the now, and maybe, I suppose, like a guide, like what some people might call spirit guides. But in any sort of formal way, there's not a canon ritual for this.
Remind me about answering that vis-a-vis spiritualism. Just remind me, I have something to say after this. Did you have another question, Stephen?
Yeah, I do. Regarding mental travel, astral travel into underworld patterns.
Okay.
So, is this something that could be done, or is it done within Alexandrian or British traditional witchcraft? And by that I mean, for example, I've done mental travel where I go down into the underworld, but the type of geography that I visualize takes on more of an ancient Greek sort of geography, where, across the river Styx, blah, blah, blah. Is there something like a traditional underworld pattern or visualization in craft?
So he's asking, for those who didn't hear, about astral travel to the underworld, to the other side, and if we do that in craft, what it looks like, et cetera, et cetera. I will say, I think it's perfectly acceptable in craft to use guided meditations that could involve the underworld. I mean, we do a lot of guided meditations in craft. I will say, it is my guess, and Brian can correct me if I'm wrong, that any ritual where we did that would most likely involve a rebirth as well, or a sort of transition from death to life on some level, to remind ourselves of the cyclical nature of the process. And it would be, I think, a teaching tool. We do have legends about the underworld and about the other world in witchcraft for sure, but I think that they are instructive. I don't think that I believe there is a literal place in the cosmos where the dead go.
Yes.
Well, there are a couple rituals, one in particular within the craft, that do involve the underworld. But it's certainly not something we're extremely focused on, but sort of like you have to think about what is the underworld. In a lot of pre-Christian, the craft does use the terminology underworld, but in a lot of pre-Christian mythologies, the underworld often sort of just represented the other side.
Yeah.
Like, we tend to nowadays think of the underworld as like hell, basically, right? Like it's down in the spooky land, but in a lot of mythologies, it represents the other side, which is what I believe it represents in craft. The other side of life.
Like in Welsh mythology, it's across the sea.
Yeah.
Right?
So yes, we do have, obviously if you were talking funerary rites or what have you, but as I said, as a religion, we don't tend to focus on the dead. So except for a few rare occasions, we don't really have any reason to go there. And we certainly don't tarry there. There's time enough for death in the grave.
Yes. I was also wondering, regarding, I don't believe the underworld is an actual, geographical place.
Yeah.
It's more like, I guess, a dimension that one would
there.
vibrate into or vibrate with.
Yeah, a vibrational space within the astral, a space in consciousness. I have some weirder beliefs about that I'll talk about later.
It's very diverse.
I see what you mean.
What we're trying to give you answers in, obviously, is the actual, craft versus, our own personal things. Like, I did a workshop for a few years called The Horned God of Death and Resurrection, and I had a guided meditation where the underworld was sort of involved. That wasn't really that was more of a experience for people to understand him, because the Horned God, the Lord of Death and Resurrection, is often associated with what we call the underworld. But like I said, I believe that the underworld, in many references, is just explaining the other side. It got called the underworld because we bury people in the ground. That's why. Yeah. So they're down there.
But I see what you mean
grow.
About it being an egregore, right? Like existing as a spiritual place one can go. In meditative work or spiritual work. I think that's common in many occult traditions, talking to the ascended masters, walking to the other side, existing. Even the concept of the Fae, and going into the mounds of the Sidhe, that's the dead, in some mythologies. So I see what you mean.
Yeah. Well, I think that if you go into the fairy faiths, which are loosely attached to the craft, and in fact, there is a blending between what we believe in craft and what they believed in the fairy faith. It's there's a crossover. Like I said, there's two sides. There's this side and there's the other side. So what lives on the other side, it's kind of like what lives here. Lots of things live here. Human beings live here, plants, animals. They're all alive. Yeah. They all live here. The planet is diverse and extremely unique. There's species on this planet we haven't even discovered yet. The other side is no different. It has a myriad of spirits that may have been, it might be a dead dandelion floating around over there now,
Maybe.
Or all the dandelions.
With the Sabbats, with the cross-quarter days, and when the veil between the worlds is said to thin, I guess, would that be a time more appropriate to make contact with that other unseen realm?
So he's asking about the cross-quarter, the Sabbats, the Wheel of the Year, and are there times that it would be better to make contact with that other realm?
Well, very particularly, obviously, it's pretty well known. In fact, so much so that it's reached into pop culture that Halloween is associated with a thinning veil, right? It is the time. It is the time when witches are most inclined to tarry with the dead. Because these Sabbats are all really big days that symbolize really big, important things. It's not to say that the dead are only important one day a year. That's not what it means. It means that there's an entire festival of one of only 8 where they're highlighted. And a lot of people will say the counterpart of May Eve is more associated with nature spirits. So, yes, I mean, these are times, but they're all very different. They're all very unique. Mostly in craft, we are focusing on our religious egregore, our goddess and our god, and the symbologies of what that means to us and our magics. But certainly the life cycles of life, death, and rebirth play out among those as well.
Yep.
Yeah. Yes, okay, cool. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you for calling.
Thanks for calling in.
No worries, keep up the good work.
Mm-hmm. Bye.
All right, see you later. Bye.
Awesome. So, yeah, if anybody wants to call in, the number is on the screen, 504-321-3472, but also in the comments. I'm going to go back a little bit because there had been a few that we missed while we were taking that call. Elohim talked about how, even though it's controversial, there are religions such as Palo Mayombe that use bones, like actual human bones, in their rituals.
We're not talking about those religions.
That was what I would say. Elohim, we don't. We don't.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing is, and a lot of people get this. I think it was we've got a priestess named Katina who grew up, born and bred in New Orleans, right? And she used to belong to something called the Religious Order of Witchcraft, and she did a video on Hex Education, and somebody commented on there, "Why didn't you practice voodoo if you lived in New Orleans?" And I was like, seriously? Like, because it's a different religion and she doesn't believe in it.
It's a separate religion.
It's not believing in a religion doesn't necessarily mean you hate it. Like, there are a lot of religions I greatly admire, but they're just not, they don't fit my belief system. There are religions I don't admire.
He loves the Mormons deeply.
More so than others. But more so than others. But yeah, it's not shade to not practice it. But
no,
voodoo is a religion, and it has a whole culture, and it doesn't come from New Orleans. It comes from Haiti, or you could argue it comes from Africa, but it definitely does not come from New Orleans. And witchcraft doesn't either. So if you wanted to practice the indigenous religion of this land, you need to conjure up some of the dead Choctaw Indians, because that was it.
Yeah, and so Zachary, I knew this question would come up. Zachary has a good point. He says that there's a famous image of Alex with a human skull on his altar. But I'm going to answer this one. You're going to find a lot of things in the media about surrounding Alex, or even Gerald, or any of the people who were within media and craft. What they did in public was not always what the religion teaches or what was popular. They staged a lot of things. It's pretty commonly known that they were, called upon for movies, and they did things that were public.
What Maxine has said about it, because obviously we weren't there, but what Maxine has publicly said about it on many occasions, so I don't mind quoting her, is that our true rituals would not be put in front of the cameras, and that those were all staged photographs for educational purposes. And then sometimes they were taken out of context. Do I know what Alex was doing sitting on that altar at Alder the Edge with a skull in his hand? I have absolutely no idea. I can tell you I have no reference of anything in Alexandrian witchcraft using a human skull. None. Don't know what he was doing. Don't know what the skull was, but it was for the cameras. And likewise, there's a lot of pictures and things where I think, what the hell's that? I've been gone on long enough now, and I've asked enough questions where I have answers to some of these things, because there are people alive who do know. And what they have said is that they were, just like in my book, Initiation to Witchcraft, we're not really showing you any real rituals. We're trying to give you the impression of the spirit of Alexandrian craft, and we certainly are putting real things in there. It's not that they're fake, and either are the pictures of Alex. But I imagine the skull is taken out of context. That was for a thing called Man, Myth, and Magic. And if you've worked for the media at all, which Christian and I have quite a lot, and Levi's had some experience too now, they're controlling the narrative, and you've got to slip in the truth. They could have handed him that skull. I've got no idea. They could have said, could you hold this? You know?
I mean, and to give you an example of this, I mean, a very popular video that if you look around the internet for Alexanders that you'll find is him conducting a Luciferian Dianic mass with a naked woman, and he's dressed as a Catholic priest, and there are altar boys. I mean, do you think that most Alexandrian covens are dressing in cassocks with Roman collars?
Well, that actually I do have an answer for. And
well,
I actually want to answer that because that came up recently, so it'd be good. I meant to do that anyway. So I'd recently posted a video that's still accessible called Legend of the Witches. Unfortunately, we don't have the whole film, I don't think. So, and Maxine's publicly explained this as well. So that was a film that was being done, and Alex was obviously asked to do it. So the people were going to do it anyway. And we don't have the full context because it was a full film, and I don't know where they even obtained what we have now. Like, I don't know. But it's obviously chopped up. So the idea of it, for what Alex was asked to do, was to help demonstrate what witches do and what witches don't do. Of course, the whole film, many of the voice contexts are all gone. So that black mass was to show what witches don't do. But when you watch the film now, it's just him doing a black mass, right? So you don't get the context that that's what it was. Likewise, as Maxine's pointed out, the chicken that was dispatched, you know, it's taken way out of context because that was to show what witches don't do. Was the chicken dispatched? Yes. But what you need to understand is this is in a time when people walked down to the market and bought live chickens and went home and wrung their necks anyway. And the chicken was eaten. It might have been a messy dispatch, but that wasn't witchcraft. That was supper. And it was done in front of a camera, really. You know, whether you agree with that or not, at that time period, it wasn't such a strange thing to go grab a live chicken, wring its neck, and cook it for dinner.
Yeah.
You know,
So
weird for us now.
I'm going to go back to a couple of questions that got skipped over. Ashton has a good one. He's talking about, given that many witches believe in Summerland or reincarnation, etc., how do you square that with necromancy? For example, what are they doing? Are they just sitting around waiting to be talked to before they reincarnate? Or they?
Well, I think we kind of already explained that, but I will venture it for you. First of all, Summerland. Summerland isn't a word that actually exists in the craft. You know, I don't know who first started getting that out there. It's fine. It's totally a fine word. You know, we do believe in the other side. I think maybe Doreen called it the land of Elflame. You know, it's whatever. It's fine. It probably exists in some sort of folklore or something. Do you know where it comes from?
Honestly, I can't remember right now. I did look it up at one point.
It's more modern, though, I think. Yeah.
The idea of it
goes back to the fields of the Elysian Fields, you know, the land of summer. It's fine. It's totally fine. In fact, I think it might be a Native American reference as well. But happy hunting grounds, you know, that sort of thing. Gone on a bandwagon. So as far as what we believe, as we told you already, in witchcraft, there's no work in the craft where we are working with ghosts. Like, that doesn't exist. There's nothing anti about it. It just doesn't exist. It's not in the liturgy. We get reincarnation, we get the underworld, the other side. That's what comes up. As far as what I believe personally, I believe that it's beyond my comprehension or yours. I don't think that death has a timeline. So, for instance, you might die. You might go to, and this is a little bit in the craft liturgy, that sometimes that the other side is a place of rest and renewal. So you go there for a time period before you come back. To me, the other side is not heaven or hell. It is simply the other side. And for whatever reason, sometimes the other side and this side do interact, intentionally or unintentionally. I hope, for your sake, Ashen, and mine, that if somebody decides to conjure us up in a necromantic ritual, we've got some say as to whether we care. I hope that that's a thing. I hope we're not dead and waiting around for some douchebag to summon us up, you know.
Get a little vulgar.
This is where I love Christian's work, is the fact that, you know, he really hints at you're often going to work with people you really knew who would care. You know, your mom is dead. If she's available, if mother doesn't have better things to do, she probably would welcome the phone call. And if she has the ability to help you, I'm sure she would, just like she would in this life. You know, but, you know, yeah, I do believe a lot of times that that it is falling on deaf ears. But I believe that about gods too. I think a lot of times people's prayers are falling on deaf ears. It's not about the other side, it's about the people.
This is an interesting thing, actually. I had a debate with somebody at one point who was trying... I had brought up the use of like certain rituals in certain traditions where they believe they could trap a soul in an object, right? By force. This is very common in certain traditions. And I kind of...
Something new.
But I like, who are you going to call? But I sort of
That's
waved
what
it
it
off.
reminds me of. Stick it in the box.
I sort of waved it off. And the person I was debating with got very angry and said, well, I've seen it happen. You just... And what I realized in that conversation, and it was a very aha moment for me, is that people think that when you debate death about them or how death works or whether or not you think somebody can be in a goby pot or whatever, they think that you're attacking whether it's like somebody has the power to do it. And I'm saying what they're not understanding is I'm negating the concept of it. Yeah. It makes no more sense. It's like you trying to argue to me there's such a thing as a married bachelor. I do not believe a human soul works that way. I do not think it is a thing that exists anywhere, right? An impossibility. A square circle, right? A square circle. It's a term used in logic classes for things that are impossible, right? Married bachelor.
I think Christian and I are married bachelors.
No, you're not.
You've seen our house at times.
Yeah. But do you get my point? Is that like I think that when people make these arguments of, well, how could you summon them if you're in the Summerland, or what is in this pot? I'm like, guys, I'm sorry, and I don't mean to knock anyone's beliefs, but I don't believe souls work that way.
I suppose the question I would ask is, if I was going to put myself in that superiority position and just talk to you as a religious person, like I had the confidence to know everything that's going on in the universe, I would say something like, well, it depends on where the soul is on the evolutionary chart of its transition. I suppose it depends on what realm they're in. I suppose it depends on their work. If they've reincarnated, of course, they're not going to show up as a ghost. If they haven't reincarnated, perhaps it's because it's no longer necessary or part of their work. I would gather that in any spirits that are interested in the work that's going on Earth fall into two categories. Hopelessly lost ones who are in some sad state, or ones that have gone beyond needing to come back into the flesh at this period in time, and they have a vested interest, becoming almost like guardian angels, right? I don't think anyone really has an answer. I don't think that every spirit is available for your 911 call, though. You know, I don't think that we die and become a part of some massive pantheon waiting for somebody to conjure us up in a ritual. I don't believe that.
I think,
and I certainly would be. I will tell you all this right now. Conjure me up in a ritual. There better be lots of wine and rubies and gold, because otherwise I'm going to get really... If you don't show me a good time when I show up, I'm going to be really cross, because I would gather if I haven't reincarnated, I have much better things to do than to show up in your basement and help you with your personal problems.
So I'm going to answer...
If not, then I don't know what to do with myself.
Since I never actually answered the what do I believe happens about death. I never actually answered it.
And please be an initiate.
I'll say this. I'm going to... Yeah, Brian doesn't care about you if you're not. I will say this, and I want to preface this with a couple things. Number one, I'm sure this will make people mad because they'll think I'm invalidating things they believe. Sorry. The other thing is this is not Alexandrian dogma, since, again, we've already discussed multiple times on this show what we believe about death is very loosely defined to begin with, and we focus on life. So I will say this. I actually don't believe it at all that souls regain the perfect egotistical consciousness that we have as we understand it now. I believe that there is but one soul in many ways, and that we are participating sparks of that consciousness. And I think that the constant coming into being and falling out of being of that is very dynamic. I think that I do mediumship readings here at Hex. What I think I'm talking to is memory. I don't think I'm actually talking to the divine soul spark of a human. I think I'm talking to memory, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that in any shape, form, or fashion. But I think if you read the deeper text of most of the world's religious traditions, even mystical Christianity on this point, this idea that the other side is just you, but you can fly, is deeply problematic. I think that it's just, and it's also sort of infantile. Like, I don't believe that that's how souls work. I think that you are a spark of consciousness in this infinite sea of sparks of consciousness that really all stem from the same source.
You're not living in matter anymore.
Yes.
Things are going to be very different. And maybe there's who knows? Maybe there's a transitional period. Maybe they let us be ghosts for a little while so that we don't get so shocked.
I think it's like a shell.
Maybe there's a small separation. Maybe you spend a period of time where you're like, you are kind of you, but you're not in the flesh. And then you graduate into living in light with no flesh. Who knows?
But a lot of that comes from spiritualism.
No, here's the thing I will say, and this goes beyond witchcraft. I don't believe anyone has the answers. Like zero. Nobody.
I do want to hit on one very important thing.
I think that we do as human beings, however, have a huge history of experiences.
Yes.
Collective experiences, and I believe that there's truth behind those experiences. But no religion. No, and that's one of the things I love about the craft is it doesn't try to. It doesn't try. It goes off of the experiences and the natural cycles of the world. It doesn't try to say, well, when you die, here's all this stuff that's going to happen to you. It just doesn't exist. And something's going to happen to you. I don't believe you cease to exist.
No.
I just believe that it's beyond our comprehension.
But I think you cease to have the concept. You're not going to care so much when you're dead that you do now.
You won't care the way we do now.
About whether or not you remember your favorite foods.
Fear will be removed. Fear will be removed. And a lot of the things we have, our desires, our fears, are connected to the flesh.
Yes.
Like if you don't have that body, I did have a witch once tell me that, that there were some entities that hated human beings because they were very jealous of the fact that we had this flesh experience. So who knows? Maybe you will want that again. Maybe you'll get it again. Maybe the druids were right and you're going to get born back into a body and then you're going to die and blah, blah, blah. But I think there's got to be an end game. One of two things is true. Either you're going to die and you're going to cease to exist and it won't matter anyway, or you're going to die and you're going to have an experience and your consciousness is going to be just different. It's kind of like how you look at yourself now from when you were like 15 years old. The things you thought were so important when you were 15 years old, they're not there anymore. You've grown and you've changed and your desires and your world has changed. And when we're 50, 60, that's going we're going to be looking back going, God, I was so pretty back then. I didn't appreciate it. So I think it's the same way with death. But the reality of it is nobody knows. So do not let any religious person tell you that they know. We have ideas. No. That's it.
I have a big belief that I think consciousness is biophilic, meaning that it loves life, biological life in particular.
Of course. Yeah.
I do not believe in a lot of discarnate power in the universe, and I know most people do. I think that I have this weird belief, and this is not Alexandrian.
I have a question for you.
This isn't Alexandrian, by the way.
I have a question for you, though.
What?
It's more for the audience than for you, but it's a fun one for you. You're very intelligent. We all know this, right?
I suppose.
Almost as smart as I am.
Maybe, perhaps.
Oh, well, no. Almost as smart as I am. But we'll just leave it at that. You've got all these ideas just like I do, but you do sit back just like any other human being and go, I really don't know.
Well, yeah, nobody knows what happens when you die.
Yeah. So I think that there's, I loved this woman named Rosalind Norton, and our Australian guest may enjoy this because she was a famous witch and painter, and more famous for being a painter in Australia. And when she died, a priest or somebody offered to do last rites for her. And she said, I'm going to leave this world the same way I came into it, bravely and unafraid. Which is marvelous. I hope I have that opportunity to say something cheeky like that.
That's cool.
But yes, you're going it's an initiation. Dying is an initiation. Mm-hmm. And we won't know until we get there. And that's what scares us. So, craft-wise, we believe something happens and we believe in rebirth.
Yes.
Rebirth of what? I guess
I think also it's important to note time only is a concept that it matters to
yes, I agree with that.
So you're already living the other lives. It's happening right now.
Time
there is no
biological,
before and after.
Isn't it?
Yes.
Time is a biological construct.
So there is no before and after beyond death.
go ask a stone how old it is.
I want to answer, I have some thoughts on that, but I want to answer Lida Diana's question. She had heard that Alex did not initiate people who worked with the dead. So, for example, pathologists, funeral directors.
Alex did not initiate people who worked with the dead directly. So if you were a mortician or if you worked directly with the dead, you were not initiated by Alex. And he had other rules as well. So every coven and every tradition has what they would deem to be a proper priest. I think a lot of that comes, and Levi can actually quote an emperor's ode to it, but I think a lot of it comes from Egypt. So when you go to Egypt, if you ever get the pleasure of going, if you're on the Nile, we all know that the entire universe of Egypt, the whole cosmology about it, its creation, its spirituality revolves around the Nile. I mean, literally their stories about the creation of the world revolves around the Nile. So on the west bank of the Nile, you had the land of the dead, and on the east bank, you had the land of life. So nobody lived on the west bank unless you were a mortuary priest or a priest that they had separate priesthoods. Yeah. So they actually had priesthoods of the dead in Egypt. It's one of the few cultures that actually had full priesthoods dedicated to the dead and death. Big deal, right? But then there were the priesthoods of life where the kings lived, the regular people lived, and so they separated the two worlds by the Nile, which is marvelous, really, honestly. And so I think that it was a belief that if you were a priest of the dead, you weren't allowed to come to the East Bank. And you were a priest of the East Bank, you were not allowed to go to the West Bank. There were very few times and very few positions where this law was broken. Mm-hmm. So it was broken occasionally with the pharaoh or occasionally with very high priesthood, where in certain rituals or festivals they would do this with great meaning, but they kept the two very separated. So for Alex, he was concerned that someone who worked with the dead in such an intimate way that they would bring that into the circle. And that would be an energy that would be contaminating to priests of the East Bank, basically. Because if you were going to classify us under Egyptian rule, we would be priests of the East Bank. So that was, I think, where his philosophy came from. I'm not sure quite how strongly I feel about it. I haven't been confronted with it. Because I'm Alexandrian, it would trigger me and I would have to really think about initiating a mortician or something like that. This doesn't translate to things like doctors or nurses who are also working with the dying, but they're healers. Yeah. So it's a different thing. But yes, that was actually a belief that he held true. Every high priest and high priestess, regardless of tradition, may have reasons that they might not want to initiate someone.
Yeah. I wanted to go back and say something, though. I think part of the problem is I have a hard time with this discussion with a lot of people. And the reason is because I just don't believe in the mechanics that they do. And it's very difficult because a lot of people get very offended. And, because they've had these deep connections to, I saw my grandma, you will not tell me that she didn't. And I'm like, I'm not trying to tell you anything, but I have my own right to have my own belief here. And I don't think souls work the way that this sort of superstitious view of them preaches. Like, I don't think that's how souls work. I think if you get messages, it's an astral shell. I think it's memory. I think the divine spark of consciousness within us is indestructible, but I sure as hell don't think that it cares about, your grocery list. Like, I don't think it does.
At least you hope not.
Well, I can't stand that. It's just my mind can't go there.
Levi's going to be a suicidal ghost.
No, he's not.
He's like, I was hoping for something better than this.
I don't think that you stick around, and I don't think that you...
Levi, Rowland, I need help with my milk.
And that's just me. Like, I respect people who believe otherwise, but it's just never been a practice for me.
I think that ghosts and spirits that knew you are more likely to, perhaps, I could see myself, if I died tomorrow, for instance, I could see if I had the ability to, if somebody said you've got two choices right now, or if I just knew, they said you could go on to the Summerlands right now, you can reincarnate right now, or you can stay around for a little while and look after your loved ones. You only get this much influence, or maybe you just watch, whatever it is. Or, hey, you should probably come with us, and I don't want to because I'm too busy looking after them. I don't know. But I could see myself doing that of my own will if it was a choice. Don't know if it is a choice, obviously. But yes, especially if I was already dead, because it's not like I don't have time, right?
But see, I don't think the conscious I survives in the same way as that. Yeah. Like, I think I don't think the conscious I is going to, I don't think you wake up after dying with somebody in front of you and it's talking to you as you were on Earth. Like, I think that a lot of that is part of the nefesh in the Kabbalistic terms, which dies when you die.
See, I just don't think
it continues.
One of the things that Levi and I don't agree with, but I can use the Egyptians to sort of marry us, is I do believe your consciousness goes on. What I also agree with Levi is I think that eventually it matters less. Because let's say, for instance, you have reincarnated with many lives, right? Well, then you're carrying many consciousnesses. So like Cain, let's say I've lived 1,000 times before. Once I'm confronted with all those times, this consciousness diminishes greatly.
Yeah.
Right? So I can get the philosophy of it. However, maybe it's a comfort thing or maybe it's a logic thing. I don't think that there would be any point in this consciousness if this intelligence, if it didn't have a contribution to the greater whole, right?
And which part of you is the question I always asked. Yeah. Are you talking about I'm a whole different human being than I was at 15, and I'm guessing if I live to be 60, I'll be a different one at 60.
I think that's a part of your organic journey, though.
Yeah, but like ego and I change dramatically.
Yeah.
And if people, are they retaining the consciousness they had when they died? That's a horrible thing to tell people who've had family members who suffered from or died from dementia. I mean, like, that's a terrible thing to tell them. Like, so this all stems from one place, though. This obsession with you go to the other side and you find out you're going to come back and be taught something. It all comes from the spiritualist movement. This is still part of their foundational principles. If you go to their website, it is what they preach. That the earth is what they call a soul school, right?
Do you know who invented it?
And I don't love that.
Who invented it, or where they got it from, Blavatsky? Or
Spiritualism has a long I like a lot about spiritualism, but it has a long history that's involved with multiple different places. They pulled from different places. The early ones were mostly Christian. But it's developed slowly over time. I mean, the New Thought movement, the New Age movement, Blavatsky, lots of people, the Ascended Masters, all that.
But if you really study some of this early occultism, you'll get a lot of really profound, wonderful things. But there's some disturbing beliefs as well.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm a huge fan of Dion Fortune. However, some of her beliefs were crazy.
Yeah.
Well, that's Blavatsky, but did she
Dion
talk about
it too?
Oh,
Dion
she got it
too.
Blavatsky. I know she talked about racial karma.
Yeah, I hate that.
And I thought that was disturbing.
It's deeply problematic and disturbing.
So, very weird. It's been a few years since I've read it. But anyway, so for our big idea, what we could tell you about Witchcraft is we don't sit around really talking about this. It's not a part of our training. What they would get is they'll get the rituals that involve it. They'll get the liturgy that involves it. Of course, I'll share my own personal belief. But it's not the focus. We are not a faith. We're not a religion that focuses on this is what's going to happen to you when you die. It's just not our focus. We are very much in the here and now. We do have it, reincarnation, rebirth, the recycling of life, death and resurrection. It's all there. In fact, our entire egregore is really about that cycle of life, death, and rebirth in many, many ways. And I believe in that. That's what I believe in. I was more afraid of death when I was a Christian than I am by any means now.
Same.
And I won't say unfortunately, I wish I could say I'm completely unafraid. I'm not completely unafraid, but it's diminished greatly. I trust. I think I trust in the process more than I used to.
I've had I had the unfortunate experience of being somebody who had a lot of death early in life. And
faced with it.
Yes, this is not a lot of people. Some people have this experience and some don't. Some people go, they live all the way into their 30s or 40s before somebody close to them dies. I come from a very large family, and I've dealt with a lot of death, very up close and personal. And
it's new for me, really.
Huh?
It's new for me.
It's not new at all for me.
I mean, in consideration, it's been within the last 3 years that I've really started getting confronted with more and more.
I've been confronted from it since childhood.
Sorry. It started before I moved here. So before I moved to New Orleans, I had a great loss. And so it's all been the last 7 years.
I've always had it. And so I think that's what has put me in a mindset of, I find...
I look so young. I was under the delusion I was going to live forever.
Bathes in blood is why. I think part of the reason
Hard
that I
to get
have...
virgins these days.
100%. Not New Orleans. The part of the reason that I have a sort of off-put nature to it sometimes is I don't find it beautiful. I don't find it spiritually moving when people are telling me about these intense, fantasies they have about being in graveyards at midnight. It's like, well, I've been at the graveyard a lot of times in my life. It's not beautiful all the time. And so I don't understand the worship of it. I also don't understand always the incessant need to act like it gives you some sort of egotistical power over others. As Christian was saying in the comments and in his book, which I do think is a fantastic book, it's all about respect, right? When death worship becomes a game, like it does in a lot of circles now, of one-upping people, of I robbed the most graves, I broke into the most cemeteries, it's like, that doesn't impress me. If you want to show me your guts or your power, how fearless you are, go volunteer at the hospice.
Go rock an AIDS baby.
Watch them die in front of you with their death rattles and their misery and their hopelessness. When you do that, and you've done that, I will consider you a priest of death. I will love your gilded statues of Anubis and your gorgeous altars covered in bones that you post on Instagram. When you do that, I will consider you the prophet of death. Until then, you're a poser. That's it.
I sort of, I was thinking earlier about something I wanted to highlight on this program, which sort of, we do go off the cuff. Once again, we have only gotten one caller from Australia tonight, you cowardly Americans. The number is 504-321-3472. Please call in with a question or about witchcraft or death or the Alexandrian tradition. Doesn't have to be about what we're talking about tonight. We love the randomness. So one of the things, which I know it's really... opens up Pandora's box in a way, but it just happens to be true. And it's a part of our work, I think, sort of. So, okay. So when me and Levi are talking about witchcraft, unfortunately, your minds are coming from a place of English white privilege. It's not your fault. And you may not even be white, but it's still affecting you because you speak English, right? If you speak English, you are suffering from English white privilege. So there was this great empire. It was the greatest empire the world has ever seen. Look it up. I didn't even know this at one point in time. I would have thought it was Genghis Khan or Rome or something like that. But the greatest empire the world has ever seen is the modern British Empire. It had more land, more influence, more money, more power than any empire that has ever existed on the face of the earth. It just happens to be true. And they controlled most of the science and most of the history and the record of history. Most people don't realize that Britain was once a part of the British Empire.
You want me to answer this?
Yes, but you'll have to get me back to
I will. I'm not going to. Hello, welcome to Covendom.
Hello, this is Hector calling from good old New Jersey. How are you?
Hi, Hector from New Jersey. How are you?
Good, thank you. So I have one question, and I'm going to try my best to articulate it as good as possible, as best as possible. So it has to do around the resurrection of worship of deities. So in the last year or so, I've been really interested in kind of learning more about Lusitanian deities. So the deities of Portugal, of what is now known as Portugal, and Spain. So deities like Bandua and Reve and whatnot. So what are your thoughts around kind of resurrecting the cult of the worship of these deities that may be deemed dead, perhaps?
Fantastic concept, the concept of dead gods, right? Can we resurrect dead gods through worship?
Right.
This goes to a very difficult thing that I'll let Brian answer. Of course, he might have a different spin on it, but I'll tell you this. I don't believe the gods are polytheistic, isolate intelligences in the cosmos. I believe in one divine source from which all things flow. I think it is dynamic. I don't think it's static. I think it has many faces, many concepts. I think it is ever flowing. I do not believe, for example, that there was an isolate intelligence in the universe called, let's say, take a Celtic god like Cain, and then it died because nobody worshipped it, and then was resurrected because somebody did. I think that these are all pools of water that are seeping up from a much deeper groundwater. And even if one pool sinks back into the groundwater, the water has not gone, right?
Got it.
So if you resurrect, quote unquote, a dead god or a dead goddess, you're in my mind, the only thing you're really resurrecting is a name.
Understood. And just a quick follow-up question on that, and I'd love to hear from Brian as well, but just so I won't lose my train of thought. So when they find, because they've been finding a lot of interesting kind of fountains and inscriptions in Portugal and Spain, and what do you think about when you go to these places now, given that they are not, you know, the places that you find in Greece and Italy and Egypt and whatnot, they're newer discoveries. When you go there, do you think you would be able to feel that power that you both have alluded to in the past when you mentioned your travels to Greece and whatnot? What do you think about that?
I'll let Brian speak to like the concept of feeling power in a place, like even if it's not been worked in a long time, because I know he's had this experience too. But absolutely, I've been to certain places that still resonate very deeply.
So it's very interesting because your question actually bleeds into the comments I was making before you called. And that was the fact that, you know, in this conversation that we're having, you know, my narrative was that there's a lot, you know, because we're talking about witchcraft. Like, that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about every pre-Christian religion that ever existed. We're not talking about the priesthood of ancient Egypt. We're not specifically talking about Eleusis. Witchcraft didn't exist then. Witchcraft is a modern English word. And if you take it back to its old English word, it's still not pre-Christian. Witchcraft as a concept, historically, is not pre-Christian. We reach back to our pre-Christian roots ad nauseum, you know, and we do that for validity. We do it in hopes that something older is more treasured or more valuable. Now, when you're talking about like powers of place, absolutely, I think places have resonance. I could tell you that the temple that we work in now, I have no idea what was on that land before us. I do suspect it was something, but it's been made powerful now because it's been worked over and over and over again in the same place and the same rituals for years. It's become a fountain of power. You know, I do believe in that, and I do believe certain places resonate with energy sources. So yes, I've been to many places that there's power there, but the power is brought through acts of worship. Now, as far as resurrecting the old gods, that's something that started occurring in early occultism. You know, I do believe that a big work of early occultists and the early craft was just that, not in the literal sense. Not that they were dead gods and now they're alive again, you know, because they're not matter, so supposedly. You know, they are, you know, matter in the sense that they might be in the oak tree and they might be in the grain, but they might be in the moon. Obviously, we know the moon is a big rock in the sky. It's not literally a goddess, but it's been a goddess for millions of years. Gods too, you know. So, you know, it's there. It's a sentient thing. So, you know, what I think about working with working with spirits of geography, you know, there's two ways of looking at this. In our craft, in witchcraft, the religion of witchcraft, which wasn't a conversation anyone was having until the night. It being a religion, you know, it was hinted as being a religious cult by Margaret Murray, Reginald Scott, Charles. The conversations we're having now wouldn't even exist if it wouldn't have happened in the 1950s with Gerald Gardner. We wouldn't be having this conversation. We might be having, and it kind of can be, because witchcraft is a scavenger religion. Witchcraft is not cultural. Witchcraft can be cultures. No. And what in truth you have is you're not really talking about dead gods, you're talking about dead cultures. Because a culture is something you have to live and experience. It can only be passed on to you if you've experienced a living member of it. Well, he sounds okay.
Yeah, he's fine. Our conversation will be okay.
So in any case, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. If you were, we're not polytheists, but we are also polytheists. So I like to say, good and that aspect of the goddess, and it becomes a singular kind of idea. Do I think
Right.
all the gods are living on cloud behind it all? Is that there are very real answer?
Absolutely.
Those were once a part of people. So it's great when you can, like the ones you mentioned, I've never heard of. You know, I've been.
Yeah.
Have I been
No,
to that?
absolutely. I think it's great what you said, what you both said. Thank you so much for
Thank
shedding
you for
some
calling
more,
in.
Thank you
more
for
light.
calling in.
Yeah,
Well, anyway,
of
to
course. That was
finish
my,
up, what
my
I is that what we do is individual and
You're not streaming anything, dear.
Are you
Trying to tell
sure?
Yeah, it's going in and out. Nobody can really follow.
Why does this happen to us all the time?
I don't know. But no, your internet's been going
Only
in and
he-
out. Hopefully most of it caught. But I mean, we got an hour and a half in, over an hour and a half.
Was it complete? It doesn't work though. I'll end up having to do a whole nother episode.
See-
Your little blip when it airs. Are we
Yeah.
streaming again, you guys?
Oh, he's looking.
No. We are perfect. So it possibly, we decided to do this because, well, I really just wanted to get away from my husband.
No, he's lying.
So anyway, so basically to point out what I want to emphasize to people is when he was practicing modern witchcraft before Gerald Gardner that we know of, like there's no factual proof of that. I'm sure that's neither here nor there, but what is responsible for everything that's going on now? It's people practicing voodoo or the ATRs or whether they were and witchcraft has catch up everyone 2021. So catch up everyone. It's a thing. Yes, you're a druid because you've decided you are. And 9 times out of 10, that's what we're encountering. Witchcraft come from the fact that we speak English. So of course we're going to describe pre-Christian peoples any magical wasn't
concept.
A witch. She was a priestess. She wasn't on the fringe of society. She was a priestess. See it considered like the Pope and holy, or whether you were considered spooky and scary in a cave, you're still on the fringe of society. Both of those things, whether the witch is considered the whole set apart, So in that sense, I can agree that the witch has that archetype that we are on the fringe of. Then you have to go to what definition of witchcraft are you using, and the truth of the matter is definition, which is very popular nowadays, which is where you had British colonialism calling everything within him, would have called what the Egyptians did witchcraft. The British men who went and studied, they weren't demons, they weren't even in that cosmology, but they did it anyway, because that was the language that they're speaking. And guess it's the dominant language, and Levi will back me up on this, English is still the most dominant language on earth.
Yep.
Most countries are required to learn English that's part of the job description. So that's a thing. The other one is the church is babies and worship the devil, but that is a definition. And that's what we're practicing. Think of a definition that doesn't fall under those 3 categories. Because I certainly.
That's not hyper modern.
Actual living current tradition of witchcraft. The actual current practice. We're not trying to say some guy in holes. Because the history of magic is much older than witchcraft. It just happens to be. Witchcraft isn't as ancient as the priests of Egypt.
They would have called it something else, is what he's saying, right?
Yes. Talking about working with a goddess, all of these things existed before witchcraft. But that's the confusion in the realms of myth. Nothing wrong with that. We partially draw upon myth. But that's the truth.
I'm trying to I'm getting text message and stuff. It's like unwatchably buffered. So like
I'm gonna hate it later.
Brian's having, but honestly, we've covered most of our ground.
Problems. Of course, there hasn't been for days. I think the staff is questions. Please type it into the chat. We'll try to.